Chapter 17. Yankees go home, Asians say. Opposition grows to U.S. bases poised against China. First published in November 2022. Yankees go home. U.S.-China rift rattles South Korea was the banner headline of the New York Times International section, October 19, 2022. It reported a protest of thousands of South Koreans who fear war between the U.S. and China will impact them. This is just the latest sign of escalating trouble for U.S. war plans in East Asia. In Okinawa, where over 70% of the U.S. military presence in Japan is stationed, protests are constant. Okinawans have voted overwhelmingly year after year against the U.S. bases. In a 2019 referendum, over 72% voted against construction of a new U.S. military base, and last month, Governor Denny Tamaki was re-elected on a platform opposing the base. Hideki Yoshikawa, director of the Okinawa Environmental Justice Project, said at a recent Code Pink event that as tensions between China and the U.S. are intensifying, Japan, as a client state of the U.S., is taking advantage of this situation, trying to push its militarization and the militarization of Okinawa. Unfortunately, this fear-mongering about Chinese threats is spreading through the Japanese government and major media outlets, end quote. In March, the government of Japan declared Okinawa a combat zone in the event of a Taiwan emergency. Okinawa is closer geographically to Taiwan than it is to Tokyo, Japan's capital. The war danger is not Okinawans' only concern. Yoshikawa recently sent a letter signed by over 100 organizations and 40 U.S. state and local elected officials addressed to the U.S. Congress, saying the bases are a constant hell for Okinawan residents. The letter called on the U.S. to honor its 25-year-old promise to close U.S. Marine Corps Futenma Air Station and cancel construction of a new U.S. base at Henoko, Okinawa. Yoshikawa highlighted the massive local opposition to the bases and underscored the importance of upholding the principle of democracy and environmental justice in Okinawa. There is non-stop rage among Okinawans against the intrusive military presence, sexual violence, ecological catastrophe, and settler dispossession by the U.S. military. Over 55 anti-war, labor, and civil society organizations in Okinawa and Japan signed the anti-base letter, as well as 45 groups in the U.S. and around the world. Signers among U.S. organizations included Code Pink, Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, DSA International Committee, Center for Biological Diversity, the Red Nation, Roots Nation, Empire Files, and World Beyond War. The DSA International Committee helped organize U.S. signers and has committed to fight to close U.S. foreign military bases and demand reparations for the human and environmental destruction they've caused. 40 DSA-affiliated state and municipal elected officials signed to support the letter, including Jabari Brisport, Nikhil Saval, Zohran Mandani, Tiffany Caban, Ruth Buffalo, David Morales, Julia Salazar, and Tanya Vyhovsky. These organizations and U.S. politicians urged members of Congress to heed calls from Okinawa and support their demands to close these dangerous and destructive U.S. military bases which only serve the interests of war profiteers. Jabari Brisport, New York State Senator and DSA representative, shared a message of support in October 2022. "I stand in solidarity," he said, "with people in Japan and across the world who are opposing construction of this base. U.S. imperialism is in direct opposition to our fight for a more just and equitable world. Our movement must be internationalist. This is a wide coalition of progressive forces in Japan who are opposing construction of this base, including socialists, labor unions, anti-war organizers, and local indigenous activists. This project doesn't only affect Okinawa, it impacts us here in New York and across the entire United States. The Biden administration requested $813 billion for the next National Defense Authorization Act. That would put total annual military spending at $1.5 trillion. That is an unfathomable amount of money to spend on imperialism and warmongering instead of caring for our communities at home. This is also about climate justice. Constructing a new base will increase the U.S. military's already out-of-control carbon emissions and destroy a local ecosystem. As it stands, the U.S. military is the world's largest non-state polluter. 140 states combined pollute less than the U.S. military. Constant fear. Residents living around Futenma Air Station live in constant fear of objects falling from U.S. military aircraft, the anti-base letter said. Worse, they have to live in fear of aircraft crashing on them. Noise levels are so bad that Japanese courts have repeatedly ruled that the plaintiffs have suffered physically and mentally from aircraft noise pollution. End quote. Residents are also exposed to cancer-causing chemicals due to accidental spills and discharge of chemicals, which have also poisoned the water, both for drinking and for agriculture. As if all this were not enough, the area is an earthquake zone. 4 major quakes with a magnitude of 6 or worse on the Richter scale have hit the area since 2001, most recently a magnitude 7.2 tremor in 2010. Veterans for Peace member Doug Loomis, who has lived in Okinawa for many years, recalls that in 2003, then U.S. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld declared the Futenma Marine Corps Air Station the most dangerous base in the world, end quote. Loomis wrote in 2018 that helicopter parts are regularly falling into residential areas. Loomis quotes defenders of the base who say, well, it was the Okinawans who built their houses next to the base of their own free will, so the danger is their fault. But, he adds, the base was originally built right after the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, when the Okinawan people were being held in concentration camps. The military bulldozed the villages and farmlands that were there, expropriated the land, and built the base. End quote. Part of a long history. While the U.S. pivot to Asia is recent, dating from 2009, its roots can be traced back at least to the 19th century. In a recent DSA International Committee webinar, Mark Tsung-Putterman explained that, quote, the U.S. state of permanent war in Asia and the Pacific today is in fact the inevitable product of a centuries-long project of U.S. hegemony in the Pacific, end quote. In a major article in Monthly Review, he cites various tactics of empire, from settler colonialism in Hawaii to colonial war in the Philippines to the formation of an open-door empire in a fabled China market as the crown jewel of U.S. Pacific manifest destiny. Now, he says, we're in a moment in which the Indo-Pacific reemerges as the primary theater of U.S. militarism, and China in particular emerges as the definitive official enemy around which the project of U.S. Pacific hegemon coheres. He refutes the concept of an inter-imperial rivalry between the U.S. and China, which gives false justification of the U.S. militarized posture as, quote, defensive in the face of ostensible Chinese belligerence. He says this lazy condemnation of intercapitalist competition obscures the centuries-long project of U.S. Pacific hegemony that is now being reconsolidated, operationalized, and expanded in a hostile Cold War posture aimed at China. The U.S. now has 375,000 Indo-Pacific Command personnel scattered across hundreds of military bases in the West Pacific. Quote, endemic sexual violence, ecological catastrophe, and settler dispossession in Hawaii, Guam, the Mariana Islands, and Okinawa continue under a geostrategic discourse that renders places and peoples mere island chains, bound in strategic containment of China, end quote. The official U.S. purpose for these bases is protection of U.S. allies from Chinese hegemonic aspirations. The reality is simpler. These are forward operations in a long-term U.S. policy of containment and very concrete preparations for war. Grassroots opposition to U.S. bases. The pivot to Asia faces multiple overlapping grassroots movements opposing the existential threat continued U.S. militarization poses to local livelihoods, cultural practices, and ecologies, end quote. The intense anti-base activism in Okinawa and Korea is matched by Chamorro activists in Guam, whose lives are totally dominated by the U.S. base there, about 2,500 miles east of the Philippines and roughly equidistant to the Korean Peninsula and the South China Sea. The anti-base fight in Guam has much in common with Puerto Ricans' battle to force closure of the U.S. bombing base on the island of Vieques some years ago. Hawaiian opposition to U.S. military presence poisoning local water supply also recently culminated in plans to close the Navy's Red Hill military fuel facility. These fights are anti-colonial, just as in the Philippines, where continuous anti-Marcos and anti-U.S. mobilizations forced major bases there to close in the 1990s, though U.S. troops are back today and the struggle continues. The anti-base mobilizations and activism face constant harassment and repression from both local authorities and their U.S. backers. Yamashiro Hiroji, head of the Okinawa Peace Research Center, was arrested in October 2016 on trivial offenses and held in solitary confinement for 152 days, long past the Japanese legal limit of 23 days, in violation of the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. His requests for bail were denied, despite a massive campaign for his release. Quote, "During my time in the cells, the interrogation was conducted on an almost daily basis," he said in an interview with Asia Pacific Journal. "Each time I was moved the few meters from my cell to the interrogation room, I was handcuffed and a cord fastened around my waist. Each time I was moved, I was subject to body search. The Japanese government made this leader of the anti-base movement an example and a warning to others. But Yamashiro Hiroji's answer is, quote, 'There will be no stopping the Okinawan resistance,' end quote. The prospects for winning a shutdown of U.S. bases in East Asia are challenging, but activists remain committed to organizing for it. On October 27th, the Pentagon issued a new national defense strategy document highlighting Russia and China as its key rivals. The report said the Pentagon would continue to build up bases and, quote, 'expand U.S. access,' end quote, in the Western Pacific region. But the rights of local people throughout the region are arrayed against the bases. They make it clear the U.S. role is exactly the opposite of defending human rights and democracy. Postscript. On April 26, 2023, at the conclusion of far-right South Korean President Yoon's summit with Biden in Washington, the White House announced the U.S. would be docking nuclear-armed submarines in South Korea. The North Korean newspaper Rodong Sinmun added that the U.S. deploys strategic nuclear bombers, nuclear carrier task forces, and even strategic nuclear submarines near the territorial waters of the DPRK, North Korea. What is more serious, the paper said, was that Biden, at a press conference after the talks, recklessly spoke about the end of regime towards the DPRK and mentioned a swift, overwhelming, and decisive response, end quote. The DPRK also denounced recent flights of nuclear-capable B-52 bombers over Korea last month. The New England Korea Peace Campaign and Massachusetts Peace Action held a protest April 28, 2022, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, during Yoon's visit to Harvard. The groups issued a statement that, quote, "Since entering office, Yoon's right-wing administration has expanded costly and provocative U.S. ROK military exercises, heightened tensions with North Korea, rolled back workers' rights, and has taken many other actions to undermine struggles for peace and justice in South Korea," end quote. The buildup of South Korean forces is part of the U.S. war escalation against China, as well as the DPRK. On April 11, 2022, the U.S. and the Philippines began their largest ever military drills. Known as Balikatan, the drills have about 12,200 U.S. troops and 5,400 armed forces of the Philippines members. Balikatan means shoulder to shoulder in Tagalog. The Philippines recently agreed to allow the U.S. access to 9 more military bases, with 4 directly facing Taiwan. The Philippines is also increasing military ties with Japan.